Hello and welcome to my channel. Sit back, close your eyes, immerse yourself in the story, and drift off to sleep peacefully. First of all, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. Long before Rome became the marble dream its emperors wished the world to remember. It was a city of mud and noise, of crowded alleyways and wooden tenements stacked 6 stories high, swaying in the summer heat and groaning under the weight of winter rains. It was a city of 1 million people, the largest on earth, and yet, among all of them, the smallest went largely unseen. Children born to poverty, to slavery, to misfortune, slept where they could. In doorways, beneath market stalls, under the stone arches of aqueducts, their thin bodies curled against the cold. This is the story of one such child, not a name recorded in the annals of Rome's Senate, not a face carved into a triumphal arch, but a child nonetheless, whose existence tells us more about the Roman world than the wars and the emperors and the golden temples ever could. Rome in the 2nd century before the Common Era was a city in crisis, though most of its citizens would not have used that word. What they saw was expansion, triumph, conquest. The Republic had defeated Carthage. It had swallowed Greece, Iberia, the coastal cities of North Africa. Wealth poured into the city from every direction: silver from Spanish mines, grain from the African plains, silk and spice from the eastern trade routes. And yet, this wealth did not spread itself evenly across the 7 hills. It pooled, as wealth always does, in the hands of the few, in the great senatorial families who owned vast agricultural estates, called latifundia, not by free Roman farmers, but by hundreds of thousands of enslaved people brought back from conquered territories. The old Roman farmer, the backbone of the Republic, found himself unable to compete. He had served in Rome's armies for years, sometimes decades, while his small farm fell into disrepair. When he returned, he sold what he could and made his way to the city, where he joined the swelling mass of the urban poor, the proletariat, those who owned nothing but their children. These families lived in Rome's insulae, the great apartment blocks that dominated neighborhoods like the Subura, the Esculium, and the Aventine Hill. The insulae were remarkable structures in many ways. Some rose to heights that would not be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. But they were also fire traps, poorly built by landlords who cared little for their tenants, and they were cold in winter, stifling in summer, and almost always damp. It is in old buildings, on a street smelt of wood smoke and fish sauce, and the ever-present tang of the fuller's vats nearby, we first intel our child. He has no name in any surviving text. He is, in the language of Roman demography, one of the anonymous many. But through the archaeology of the city, through the evidence of Roman law, Roman petition, Roman tree, and satire, we can reconstruct his world with surprising precision. We know what he would have eaten, if he was lucky enough to eat. We know how old he was likely to be when he died. We know what his mother feared and what his father hoped for. And we know how small his hopes really were. The Roman state made no systematic provision for children in poverty. There was no institution, no public orphanage, no organized charity in the modern sense. What existed, instead, was a patchwork of private generosity, civic obligation, and the desperate ingenuity of the poor there themselves. The collegium, the voluntary association of craftsmen or freedmen or neighbors, sometimes collected funds to bury the dead and care for the living. Wealthy patrons might distribute food from their doorsteps, a practice known as the sportula, in exchange for the political loyalty of their clients. And the state, from the time of Augustus onward, distributed free or subsidized grain to the registered poor of the city, a program known as the annona, which by the height of the imperial period fed perhaps 200,000 people every month. But none of this reached everyone. It did not reach the unregistered, the newly arrived, the enslaved, the children of women who had no citizen standing. And so there were always those who slipped through, who were found sleeping in doorways, curled under carts, sheltering beneath the great porticos of temples, the covered arcades of the forums when the rains came. Rome received a great deal of rain. The city sits in a Mediterranean climate, and while its summers are dry and blazing, its winters are wet and surprisingly cold. The Tiber flooded regularly, sometimes catastrophically, inundating the low-lying regions of the city. The Thighs, the Forum Embroiarium, the neighborhoods along the riverbank, and leading behind mud, sickness, and the smell of standing water. The great drains of the Cloaca Maxima, that marvel of early Roman engineering begun in the period of the kings and expanded over centuries, could not always keep pace. After heavy rains, streets became rivers. Alleyways turned to mud, and the children of the suburb, who played in those streets, who ran messages for shop owners, who begged at the steps of temples, who sold small bundles of firewood or carried water for a coin. These children were left wet and shivering when the skies opened. A child sleeping in the rain is not a metaphor in the Roman world. It a historical reality attested in dozens of sources. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century of the Common Era, describes the danger of Rome's streets at night. The tiles falling from rooftops, the chamber pots emptied from upper windows, the criminal and the desperate lurking at every corner. He describes, too, the contrast between the warm interiors of the wealthy, their braziers glowing, their thick wool curtains drawn, and then the misery of those outside. The philosopher Seneca, writing from his comfortable villa, expresses in one of his letters a kind of tortured awareness of the poverty visible from his window. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, records in his private meditations his effort to cultivate indifference to luxury and comfort, and in doing so reminds us thus that luxury and comfort were precisely what most of the city's inhabitants did not have. The Romans were not entirely indifferent to childhood poverty. Roman law distinguished between the freeborn child, the freed child, and the enslaved child, and these distinctions mattered enormously. A freeborn Roman citizen who fell into destitution had certain theoretical protections, though they were inconsistently applied. A child born of a free woman was free-born, regardless of who the father was, and had a claim on the status of citizen. Though that status, without property, without connections, without a patron, offered little practical protection against hunger and cold. An enslaved child had no legal standing at all. He was property, and his welfare was entirely dependent on the inclinations of whoever owned him. And yet the archaical reticle complicates this picture in touching ways. In Roman cemeteries, from Ostia to Pompeii to the catacombs beneath Rome itself, we find the graves of children marked with small inscriptions that speak of love. To the sweetest soul, reads one, he lived 1 year, 11 months, and 4 days, reads another. The precision of that count a testament to how carefully a parent had measured the brief span of a child's life. Toys have been found in children's graves. Small clay dolls, wooden horses, bronze rattles. Some graves contain the remains of pets, buried alongside their young owners. Whatever the indifference of Roman law and Roman economics, Roman parents grieved their children as parents have always grieved, with an intensity that finds expression even in stone, even across 2,000 years of silence. Part 2.0 The streets of the Subura daily life act in survival in Rome's poorest neighborhoods. To understand how a child came to sleep in the rain in Rome, we must understand the neighborhood that shaped him. The Subura was the most densely populated district of the city. A valley between the Esquiline and Aviminal hills, where the streets were narrow enough for neighbors on opposite sides to lean out their windows and shake hands. It was notorious in Roman literature for its noise and its crime and its overwhelming vitality. Juvenals, the Marshal, described it with a mixture of disgust and affection. It was, in modern terms, both a slum and a marketplace, a place where the poor lived and worked and died in close, uncomfortable proximity. The ground floors of the insulae in the Subura were typically occupied by shops. The tabernae, small one-room workshops, and retail spaces that opened directly onto the street. A shoemaker here, a bronze worker there, a woman selling at food from a counter built into the front wall of the building, a cloth dyer, a scribe who wrote letters for those who could not write themselves. These shops were also frequently the homes of the people who worked in them. A shoemaker might sleep in the back of his taberna behind a curtain, surrounded by his tools and his stock. A family of 4 or 5 might share a single room no larger than a modern bathroom. The upper floors of the insula, the higher you went, the cheaper the rent, and the more dangerous the building, were divided into small apartments, some consisting of a single room, some of 2 or 3. Children in these households were not idle. Roman childhood, at least among the poor, was not the protected space of play and education that modern Western societies have constructed. Children worked. A boy of 7 or 8 might be employed running errands for a craftsman, carrying goods across the city, watching a stall in the market while the owner attended other business. Girls of a similar age helped their mothers with domestic tasks, grinding grain, carrying water from the public fountains that served the neighborhood carding wool. The Roman economy ran, in part, on the labor of children who were too young to have any choice in the matter. Education was available, but unevenly. Rome had no state school system. Elementary education, reading, writing, basic arithmetic, was provided by private teachers, the literators who set up in the porticos and open spaces of the city, sometimes literally in the street. A child whose parents could afford even a small fee might attend such a school. The philosopher Seneca describes with irritation the noise of a school operating in the portico beneath his lodgings, the chanting of letters and numbers, the teacher's voice, the scratch of styluses on wax tablets. For many children of the poor, however, even this modest education was beyond reach. They grew up unable to read, their world circumscribed by the spoken word, by memory, by the visual language of the city's public art and monumental architecture. The streets themselves were an education of a different kind. Rome's public spaces were extraordinarily rich in information and spectacle. The forums were lined with inscriptions, with monuments, with the rostra where orators addressed the crowds on matters of law and politics. The temples displayed works of art looted from the Greek world, sculpture of extraordinary beauty, the great public baths, the thermae, which were free or nearly free to enter, were not merely places of hygiene, but of social life, of conversation, of the informal exchange of news and rumor that held the city's community together. A child moving through these spaces absorbed, even without formal instruction, something of the Roman world's self-understanding, its pride in conquest, its celebration of military virtue, its complex hierarchies of citizen and slave, of Roman and foreigner, of man and woman and child. Water was central to life in Rome in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. The city was served by 11 major aqueducts by the height of the imperial period, delivering an estimated 1 million cubic meters of fresh water every day. A per capita supply that would not be matched by any European city until the 20th century. This water flowed into the city's public fountains, the lacus, of which there were hundreds scattered throughout every neighborhood. It filled the baths, the ornamental pools, the private gardens of the wealthy, and it created, in the streets, a constant presence of flowing water, from fountains that never stopped, from channels cut into the road surfaces, from the overflow of public basins. For a child of the suburb, the fountain at the end of the street was a gathering place, a source of life, a landmark that anchored the geography of the neighborhood. It was also, when the rains came and the gutters overflowed and the streets turned to mud, part of an urban landscape that could become treacherous. Roman streets had no sidewalks in the modern sense. Those stepping stones were provided at crossings to allow pedestrians to cross above the mud and waste that accumulated in the roadway. In heavy rain, these stepping stones disappeared beneath rushing water. The streets became impassable for carts, dangerous for children, and the doorways of temples and the cover arcades of the larger buildings became the only shelter available. It was in such a doorway that the history we are tracing reaches its most intimate moment. A child, alone or perhaps with a sibling, caught by a sudden downpour, sheltering beneath an overhang of stone, knees, chest, watching the water run in brown rivers down the cobblestones. The rain on Rome is not gentle. When the Mediterranean storms come in from the west, they bring sudden, heavy downpours that can last for hours. The temperature drops. The light changes. And a child without a warm interior to retreat to simply waits, and sometimes, exhausted by a day of work, or wandering or hunger, simply sleeps. This image, the sleeping child in the rain, has a particular resonance in the history of Rome because it recurs in various forms throughout Roman literature and art. It appears in the visual language of Roman funerary monuments, with sleep of death, often figured as a child resting. It appears in the rhetoric of Roman reformers, men like the Gracchi brothers, who in the late 2nd century BC made the condition of Rome's for a matter of political urgency, and who described in their speeches the human cost of the city's inequality. Tiberius Gracchus, seeking land reform that would restore dispossessed farmers to the Italian countryside, spoke of the Roman soldiers who had fought and bled for Rome but who owned nothing, who wandered with their wives and children place to place, who slept in the open air. The wild beasts of Italy, he said, have their caves and their dens to retreat to, but the men who fight and die for Italy have nothing except the air and the light. Part 3. Rome's children in law and in love. The legal statuses of children and the reality of family life. Roman law was one of the great intellectual achievements of antiquity. A sophisticated, evolving body of principles and precedents that has shaped legal systems across the world to the present day. And Roman law had a great deal to say about children. What it said, however, was not always what a modern reader would expect. The fundamental legal concept governing the Roman family was the patria potestas, the power of the father. Under this doctrine, the male head of a Roman household had near absolute authority over all members of his family, including his adult sons and daughters, his grandchildren, and any slaves he owned. This authority included, in the early period of the Republic, the power of life, death, the aestai nasisk. A Roman father could legally kill a member of his household. He could expose a newborn infant, leaving it at a designated location in the hope that someone would take it in, or leaving it to die. He could sell his children into slavery. Though Roman custom and later law placed increasing restrictions on this practice, the exposure of infants, the abandon of newborns who, not wanted or could not be supported, was a regular feature of Roman life. It was not secret. It was not shameful in the way that modern societies understand shame. It was, rather, a recognized practice whose moral status debated, but whose reality was undeniable. The most commonly cited location for such abandonment in Rome was the Columna Lactaria, the milk column, near the Forum Holitorium, the vegetable market. There, infants were left, and there, those who wished to take them in for adoption, for sale, or for raising as slaves, could find them. The Roman physician Cyrenius of Ephesus, writing in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, provides in his treatise on gynecology a detailed account how to assess a newborn's liability. Instructions that presuppose the possibility that a father might decide not to raise a child he judged unfit. He lists the signs of a healthy infant: the proper cry, the right color, the correct size, the absence of visible defects. These were the criteria by which Roman families made decisions that we find deeply troubling, but which to them represented the exercise of practical wisdom in circumstances of genuine hardship. Not all exposed children died. Many were taken in by those who wanted children, by those who ran brothels and wanted workers. The Emperor Augustus, in his sweeping program of social legislation at the end of the 1st century BC, attempted to incentivize the raising of children, both to address Rome's declining birth rate among the citizen class and to provide a more stable social order. His legislation rewarded families who raised 3 or more children with legal privileges, the Austrian Liberorum, and penalized the unmarried and childless. But these measures were aimed primarily at the upper classes, whose property and inheritances were the true object of the legislation. For the poor, they changed little. The practice of alumni, informal adoption, or the raising of foundlings within a household was widespread in Rome. A family that found an exposed infant might take it in, raise it as part of the household, and form genuine bonds of affection. Roman epitaphs record the relationships between alumni and their foster parents with the same language of love that appears in inscriptions for biological children. The boy raised as an alumnus was not legally equivalent to a son. He had no automatic right of inheritance, no claim to the family name in the formal sense. But in the emotional and practical life of the household, the distinction often meant little. The mother's position in all of this was complex. Roman law gave women no formal authority over their children. The pater potestas was a male institution. A woman had no legal power to prevent her husband from exposing a newborn, from selling a child, from making decisions about a child's future. And yet Roman literature, Roman inscriptions, and Roman art make clear mothers love their children with fierce protectiveness, and that their informal authority within the household was often considerable. A Roman mother out of the husband became, in practice, if not always in law, the head of her household. She managed property, arranged marriages, guided her children's careers. The idealized Roman mother, of whom Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, was the supreme example, was educated, strong-willed, and devoted to her children's formation and success. For the poor, these ideals operated in a harsher register. A mother in the Sabura had fewer options, fewer protections, and fewer resources than a senator's wife. But the love was not different. The grief was not less. When a child died, and children died with terrible frequency in ancient Rome, the mourning was the same. The infant mortality rate in the Roman world has been estimated by modern demographers at somewhere between 200 and 300 deaths per 1,000 live births in the first year of life alone. Put differently, roughly 1 in 4 children born in Rome did not survive their first birthday. By the age of 10, as many as half all children born might already be dead. These are not abstract statistics. They are individual stories of loss, repeated millions times across the centuries of Roman history. They explain the precision of those funerary inscriptions. He lived 1 year, 11 months, and 4 days. Because each day was counted. Because each day was precious. Because parents in a world of high child mortality learned not to take any day for granted. They explained the amulets and charms that Roman parents hung around their children's necks. The bulla, the golden locket worn by freeborn boys until they came of age. The red coral worn to ward off the evil eye. The small terracotta figurines of protective deities placed in household shrines. In a world where so much was beyond human control, these small acts of protection carried enormous emotional weight. Part for the Reform, the Republic, public, and the poor, the Gracchi, Kaiser, and Augustus. Political responses to urban poverty. The condition of Rome's poor was not merely a social problem. It was, from the middle of the 2nd century onward, an acute political crisis that shaped the entire trajectory of Roman history, contributing in ways that historians have long debated to the fall of the Republic and the rise of the emperors. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus was elected of the plebs in 133 BC. He came from one of Rome's distinguished families. His father had been a consul and a censor. His mother, Cornelia, was the daughter of Spufricanus, the general who had defeated Hannibal. By all expectations, Tiberius Gracchus was destined for a conventional career of dignified public service. Instead, he became the first in a series of Roman politicians who attempted to address the structural inequalities of Roman society, and the first die for it. Tiberius's programs centered on the Ager Publicus, public land that the Roman state had acquired through conquest and which was, by law, supposed to be available to all citizens, though practice the great senatorial families had long since monopolized it. He proposed, through the tribunate, to enforce the old legal limits on how much public land any single citizen could hold, and to redistribute the excess to the landless poor. It was not a radical proposal in legal terms. It was a restoration of existing law, not a revolutionary innovation, but it threatened the property interests of Rome's most powerful families, and they opposed it with every tool available to them: legal obstruction, political manipulation, and ultimately, violence. Tiberius Gracchus was murdered in 130 BC, clubbed to death by a mob of senators and their supporters on the Capitoline Hill. His body was thrown in the Tiber. His younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the cause a decade later. With a broader and more sophisticated program, Gaius added to the land question a proposal for subsidized grain distribution to Rome's urban poor, the foundation ultimately of the annona that would feed the city for centuries. He too was killed in 121 BC, by another senatorial reaction. 3,000 of his supporters were also killed, and their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. The deaths of the Gracchi marked a turning point. For the first time, armed political violence had been used to resolve a constitutional dispute in Rome. The precedent, once established, proved impossible to extinguish. Over the next century, the Republic was torn apart by a succession of political conflicts, some of them genuinely ideological, some of them straightforward power struggles dressed in ideological clothing, that grew progressively more violent. The figures of Marius and Sulla, of Pompey and Caesar, of Mark Antony and Octavian, moved through a Rome that was simultaneously the most powerful state in the world, and a society could not solve the problem of how to share its power and its wealth. Julius Caesar, in his brief period of political dominance in the 40s BC, undertook a series of measures that addressed urban poverty with characteristic energy and scale. He settled perhaps 100,000 of Rome's poor in new colonies throughout the Mediterranean world, with reduced pressure on the Senna city's overwhelmed housing and food supply. He launched building programs that provided employment. He reformed the grain dole, trimming its rolls from 300,000 recipients to 150,000, but also making its administration more systematic. He was assassinated before most of these programs could be fully implemented. It was Augustus, Octavian, the great-nephew and adopted heir of Caesar, who finally brought the century of civil war to an end, and in the process, Trandoces, the Roman state from a republic into something new, something for which Roman political vocabulary, no precise word, a money that called itself a republic, empire that retained the forms of citizen government while concentrating real power in the hands and his family. The Augustan settlement was, among other things, a massive program of urban management. Augustus organized the city of Rome into administrative regions for the first time. He created a permanent brigade, the Vigiles, to address the constant threat of fires in the insulae. He reformed and expanded the grain supply. He built so much, and so magnificently, that he could claim, with only modest exaggeration, to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. But the marble and the monuments were for the eyes of history, for the people sleeping in the doorways, for the children caught in the rain. The Augustan transformation was more ambiguous. The price of stability was the loss of political freedom, the assemblies of the Republic, through which the poor had once exercised at least a formal influence on public affairs, were gradually hollowed out. The tribunes, once the champions of the plebs, became functionaries of the imperial system. The urban poor were fed and entertained. The penem et circenses, the bread and circuses of Juvenal's famous phrase. But they were no longer participants in the political process in any meaningful sense. Part 5. Imperial Rome and the Institutionales Alaesvekirche, the Alimenta, the and church structures of care in a world without a safety net. The Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD, the period of Rome's greatest territorial extent, when the empire stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, introduced one of the most remarkable social welfare programs in the ancient world. The alimenta was a system of subsidized loans to Italian farmers, with the interest payments used to fund the care and feeding of poor children in the towns and cities of the Inscriptions recording the program have been found in dozens of Italian municipalities. The program, under Trajan and his successors, provided for several thousand children, mostly boys, with a smaller number of girls, in communities throughout the peninsula. The alimenta was not charity in the modern sense. It was an investment in the future citizens and soldiers of the empire. The practical effect, however, was to provide a degree of food security to children who would otherwise have gone without. It was administered through the local municipal governments, and its reach, while significant, was limited. It did not extend to Rome itself. The capital was whiffed by the grain dole, which applied to adult male citizens. And it did not reach all of the poor, or all of the children of the poor. The collegiate system, the voluntary associations of tradesmen, freedmen, and neighbors provided another layer of informal protection. Collegia existed for almost every trade and profession in the Roman world. They organized festivals, maintained shrines to their patron deities, collected dues from their members, and, crucially, provided for the burial of members who died poor, in a world where proper burial was not merely a social nicety, but a religious necessity. The unburied dead were believed to wander as restless spirits, the larvae and lemures of Roman religious imagination. The guarantee of a decent burial was a significant benefit. Some collegia also provided assistance to the living members and their families in times of hardship. The synagogues of Rome's substantial Jewish community, numbering perhaps 50,000 people by the 1st century of the Common Era, maintained their own systems of communal support, including the care of orphans and widows. The Jewish community was, by Roman standards, remarkably organized in its internal welfare provisions, and this organization was one of the features that distinguished it from the surrounding population. And then, gradually, from the 1st century of the Common Era onward, there appeared in the backstreets of Rome's neighborhoods a new kind of community. The early Christian churches. These communities, small, initially secretive, meeting in private homes, gathered around the shared meal they called the agape, the love feast. Organized around a principle of mutual care that was, if not entirely without precedent in the Roman world, dramatically more systematic and more inclusive than anything the civic institutions of Rome provided. The early Christian communities fed their poor, cared for their sick, buried their dead, and took in their orphaned children. They did so not as an act of political calculation or civic duty, but as an expression of theological conviction. The belief that the care of the poor was not optional charity, but divine obligation, that in the hungry child in the doorway one encountered something sacred. The impact of this conviction on Roman society was, over the long term, revolutionary. But in the first and second centuries of the Common Era, the Christian communities were tiny islands in a vast sea of urban poverty, and they could not reach all who needed reaching. The children of the suburra, the children sleeping in the rain, the children sold into slavery or exposed in alleyways, most of them were beyond the reach of any institution, any program, any network of care. Part 6. Medicine, Dis, and the vulnerability of child health, illness in the Roman urban world. The Roman world was, by modern standards, extraordinarily dangerous to human health, and children were its most vulnerable members. Great cities of the empire, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, were ecological disasters in terms of infectious disease. The combination of dense population, inadequate sewage disposal, contaminated water supplies despite the aqueducts, and close contact between humans and animals created conditions in which epidemic disease was a permanent feature of life. The Roman physician Galen of Pergamon, who practiced in Rome in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and whose writings shaped medical knowledge for the next 14 used, left detailed accounts of the diseases he encountered in the city. He described malaria, the intermittent fevers that plagued the low-lying neighborhoods near the Tiber, with a clinical precision that allows modern historians to identify the parasite involved. He described intestinal diseases, respiratory infections, the periodic Great Plagues, including the Antonine Plague 165 Eve 65 to 180 AD, which may have killed as many as 5 million people across the empire, and was most certainly smallpox or measles, or possibly both. Children were disproportionately affected by all of these diseases. Their immune systems, not yet hardened by exposure, were more vulnerable to infections that adults might survive. Infants were particularly at risk, especially in the crucial months of weaning. The transition from breast milk to solid food was, in a world without refrigeration and without understanding of germ theory, an extraordinarily hazardous moment. Contaminated food and water killed children had survived infancy, and the crowded conditions of the insulae ensured that infectious diseases spread rapidly through families and neighborhoods. Roman medicine was not helpless in the face of these challenges. Galen's understanding of the human body, built on the earlier foundations of Hippocratic medicine, was sophisticated in its descriptive accuracy, even when it was wrong about mechanisms. Roman physicians prescribed dietary regimens, herbal medicines, surgical interventions, and rest. They understood, if imperfectly, the relationship between dirty water and disease. The Roman writer Vitruvius, in his architectural treatise, recommends avoiding the construction of buildings in swampy areas because of the unhealthy vapors they produced, a formulation that reached toward the truth without grasping it. For the poor, however, formal legal care was largely inaccessible. Physicians charged fees. The most skilled physicians Those who served the imperial court, or the households of the wealthy, were entirely beyond the reach of those who lived in the suburra. What the poor had instead was a combination of folk remedies, the advice of neighbors and midwives, the resources as of the temple of Asclepius on the Tiber island, where the sick came to sleep in the hope of divine healing, and the sheer biological resilience of those children who survived long enough to develop immunity to the most common diseases of their environment. A child who fell ill in the rain in Rome faced particular dangers. Hypothermia was a risk in the cold months. Roman winters, while mild by northern European standards, were genuinely cold, especially at night, especially in wet conditions. To pneumonia, or what ancient physicians called pleurisy and peritpneumonia, was a major killer. A child already weakened by inadequate nutrition was far more susceptible to infection than a well-fed one, and the children of the poor were, almost universally, inadequately fed by the standards of what human biology requires. The Roman diet, even for the relatively comfortable, was heavily weighted toward carbohydrates, bread, emmer porridge, games, with animal protein appearing infrequently in the diets of those who could not afford meat regularly. For the very poor, the diet was even more limited. Bread, sometimes a bit of salt fish, water. The grain dole, when available, provided a basic caloric floor, but not a nutritionally complete diet. Vitamin deficiencies, of vitamin C causing scurvy, of vitamin D causing rickets, of various B vitamins, were common among the urban poor. The skeletal evidence from Roman burial sites, examined by modern physical anthropologists, confirms what the literary sources suggest. The bones of the poor were shorter, more frequently marked by childhood illness and nutritional stress, more likely to show the signs of hard physical labor from an early age. Part 7. The Voice of Rome's Children. What ancient sources tell us about children's lives and inner worlds? We cannot, of course, hear the voice of the child sleeping in the rain. He left no record. The historical record of antiquity is overwhelmingly the record of the literate, the powerful, the male, the adult. But through the literature of Rome, its poetry and satire, its philosophical reflections, its occasional derivatives of childhood, we can catch glimpses what it might have been like to be young and poor in the greatest city in the world. The Roman poet Horace, born in 65 BC, the son of a freed slave who worked as a collector of auction proceeds in the southern Italian town of Venusia, left in his poetry a record of what it meant to grow up poor in the Roman world and to make something of oneself. His father, he tells us, accompanied him personally to Rome for his education, though they could not afford the finest schools. He describes the other students, the sons of centurions, going to school with their satchels and writing tablets on their arms, each paying a fee on the ides of the month. He describes the humility of his origins, and the pride he distinguishes in his father's careful, artificial ambition for him. Horace rose to become one of the greatest poets in the Latin language. But for every Horace, there were thousands who never learned to read, who never had a father willing or able to sacrifice for their education, who remained in the suburra, in the darkness, in the rain, the satirist Juvenal, more bitter, more despairing than Horace, describes in his third satire the nightmare of Roman urban life, through the voice of a friend who is leaving the city for the countryside. The city, says this friend, is impossible for the poor. Everything costs money. The rich man's house is supported by pillars, but the poor man's insula threatens to fall on him at any moment. The smoke fills his apartment. He cannot sleep for the noises. The streets are dangerous, and if a fire breaks out, and fires broke out constantly, the poor man loses everything he has. The philosopher and statesman Cicero, who was himself of municipal Italian origin rather than Roman aristocratic birth, has a great deal to say about poverty and wealth, about justice and obligation. But he says most of it in the abstract. When he descends to particulars, his contempt for the urban poor is undisguised. He dismisses the craftsmen and shopkeepers as sordid, calls the grain dole a corrupting indulgence, and reserves his civic idealism for the propertied citizen who could stand on his own feet. Cicero's Rome is a Rome of the forum and the courtroom and the elegant villa. The suburb barely exists for him. But even in sources that are not concerned with poverty, children appear in ways that humanize the roaming past with sudden and unexpected force. Pliny the Younger, writing at the end of the 1st century, the Common Era, describes in his as many letters the death of the young daughter of his friend Minucius Fundanus. The girl was 13 years old. She had, Pliny says, completed it her 14th year and had combined the wisdom of age with the sweetness of child and the dignity of a grown woman. She loved her tutors, she read her books, she played with restraint and wisdom, and she was betrothed, and her wedding was planned, and then she died. Pliny describes his friend's grief and his own with a delicacy and an emotional generosity that cuts across the distances of 2,000 years. The child in Pliny's letter was privileged. She had tutors, she had books, she had a betrothal to a suitable young man, and a father who was a senior official of the empire, and a circle of distinguished friends who mourned her loss in elegant prose. The child sleeping in the rain had none of these things. But they were both children. They were both subject to the terrible randomness of death in a world where medicine could not reliably intervene. They were both embedded in network of and care and loss that mattered to those who knew them, even if only one of them left a trace in the historical record. Part 8. Slavery and childhood, the most vulnerable of all. Enslaved children in Roman society. Among Rome's children, those in the most precarious position of all were the enslaved. Slavery was not peripheral to the Roman economy. It was structural, foundational, ubiquitous. Estimates of the slave population of Italy at the height of the Republic and early Empire range from 1/5 to 1/3 of the total. In the city of Rome itself, slaves were everywhere, in the households of the wealthy, in the workshops and businesses of the middle classes, in the streets and markets. in the imperial bureaucracy, in the mines and agricultural estates of the countryside. Children became enslaved in several ways. They were born to enslaved mothers. Since under Roman law, the legal status of a child followed that of the mother. They were captured in war. The conquest of a city or region typically resulted in the enslavement of its population, and children captured in this way might find themselves transported enormous distances from their homes and families. They were sold by their families in times of desperation. They were exposed as infants and taken in by those who intended to raise them for sale, and they were kidnapped. The illegal but persistent practice of child abduction for the slave trade was a constant concern in the Roman world, and parents in the poorer neighborhoods of Rome lived with the awareness that a child who strayed too far from home might not come back. The experience of enslaved children in Rome enormously according to circumstances. A child enslaved in a wealthy household might receive education, food, clothing, and a degree of the physical comfort unavailable to many free children of the poor. Roman slave owners invested in the skills of their slaves, recognizing that a literate, numerate, trained slave was worth far more than an unskilled one. Some enslaved children received educations superior to those of freeborn children from modest backgrounds. Some became, through talent and luck and the goodwill of their owners, people of significant accomplishment. The philosopher Epictetus, one of the most profound moral thinkers of the ancient world, was an enslaved man, born into slavery in Hierapolis in Phrygia, who came to Rome as the property of a freedman who served in Nero's imperial household. But these are the exceptional cases. Most enslaved children experienced a childhood of relentless labor, physical vulnerability, and total dependency. They could not refuse orders. They could not object to mistreatment. They had no legal recourse if abused. Roman law did provide some protections for slaves against the most extreme forms of violence. The Emperor Hadrian prohibited the killing of slaves without cause, and the jurist Gaius noted that the treatment of slaves by their owners was subject to legal oversight. But the enforcement of these protections was inconsistent, and the threshold for what counted as excessive was calibrated to a world in which the whip was a routine tool of management. Enslaved children who worked in the street, selling, running errands, begging on behalf of their owners, were part of the visible landscape of Roman urban life. They were, in some ways, the most visible of all. Their presence was unremarkable, their absence unnoticed. If one of them, caught in a sudden downpour, took shelter in a doorway and, exhausted, fell asleep, who would record it? Who would note that he was cold, that he was alone, that the rain had soaked through his single garment and was pooling beneath him on the stone? Part 9. The sight ate night. What looked like after dark? And who was left outside? The Rome that most of us know from popular imagination is a city of daylight, of white marble temples gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, of senators in togas conducting the business of empire, of legions marching in ordered columns, of the Colosseum packed with spectators roaring at the games. But Rome at night was a different city entirely, and it was the nighttime city that the child in the rain most fully inhabited. Ancient cities did not have public street lighting in any systematic sense. There were torches and lanterns carried by private individuals, hung in the doorways of taverns and brothels and public buildings. The occasional bonfire or religious illumination, and the light of the moon, which mattered enough that the Roman calendar was originally built around the lunar cycle. But the streets of Rome at night were profoundly dark by modern standards. Moving through them required a light, a companion, or the kind of intimate familiarity with aid that only long residence confers. The city at night was also loud in ways that its daytime roar tended to mask. Julius Caesar, during his time as dictator, had prohibited wheeled vehicles from Rome's streets during the day, an ordinance preserved under the empire in an attempt to manage the catastrophic traffic congestion of the daytime city. The result was that Rome's goods were delivered at night, when the wagons and carts were permitted to enter. Juvenal, in the same third satire in which he describes the miseries of urban poverty, complains that sleep is impossible in Rome. In Rome, the crashing of the wagons, the shouting of the drivers, the clatter of iron wheels on cobblestones made the night as noisy as the day, perhaps noisier. Through this nighttime cacophony, the wagons, the voices from taverns still open late, the calling of night watchmen, the barking of dogs, the distant sound of a water organ playing somewhere in a wealthy house, and always, in the rainy season, the sound of rain on tile and stone and the rushing of water in the drains. A child might find a doorway deep enough to shelter in, a corner carved by the intersection of two walls, a space between columns, and curl there and sleep. The Romans knew their city at night, through fear as well as familiarity. Juvenal's account of the nighttime streets as a space of danger, the falling tiles, the criminal lurking, the drunk who picks a fight. But it was also a space of community for those who had no daytime home. The itinerant workers who moved through the city doing the work that could not be done by day, the watchmen and water carriers and lamp trimmers, the sellers of hot food who served the workers emerging from late-night shifts. These people, moving through the dark streets with their lights, were part of the city's hidden economy, and among them, the children of the poor were present, running errands, selling small goods, or simply there because there was nowhere else to be. Part teen. After Rome. The memory. Oh, urban shelled. What Roman history teaches the modern world about poverty, childhood, and human dignity? The Roman Empire did not end in a single moment. It transformed slowly and unevenly for centuries, through the crises of the 3rd century, through the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, through the division of the empire into eastern and western halves, through the great migrations of peoples that the Romans called the barbarian invasions, and that modern historians understand as complex process of political and cultural transformation. The Western Empire, centered on Rome, ceased to exist as a functioning political entity in 476 AD. When the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer, the Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, continued for another 1,000 years, until the Audi conquest of 1453. Throughout all this transformation, basic contents of urban poverty changed slowly. The institutions that had tried to address it, the grain doll, the alimenta, the collegium, disappeared or were transformed. New institutions took their place, above all the Christian Church, which by the 4th century had become the official religion of the empire, and which, through its network of parishes, monasteries, asteries, and charitable institutions, inherited much of the responsibility for caring for the poor that the Roman state had never fully assumed. The churches of late antiquity organized hospices for the sick, orphanages for abandoned children, and food distribution for the hungry with a systematic ambition that drew on both the Roman administrative tradition and the Christian theological imperative. The great 4th century bishop Basil of Gaisaia in Cappadocia built outside his city what he called the Basiliad, a complex institutions for the poor, the sick, the orphaned, and the stranger that was so large it was described by contemporaries as a city in itself. It had hospitals, workshops to train the poor in trades, accommodation for travelers and the homeless, a kitchen, and a staff of administrators and caregivers. Nothing quite like it had existed before, and it pointed toward the institutions, the hospital, the orphanage, the poorhouse, that would define the social welfare of medieval Europe. But even with the growth of these institutions, basic vulnerability of children in poverty was not resolved. It was not resolved in the medieval period, or the early modern period, or the industrial period, when Charles Dickens described children sleeping in London's streets with a specificity and fury he drew on his own childhood experience of poverty. It is not fully resolved today in a world in which millions of children still sleep without adequate shelter, still go without adequate food, still live in conditions of privation that any civilization with the resources to address them ought to be ashamed to permit. The child sleeping in the rain in Rome is not merely historical curiosity. He is a presence, a claim on our attention, a challenge to the self-satisfaction of every civilization that has built magnificent monuments while toiling to ensure that its most vulnerable members were sheltered and fed and loved. Rome built the Pantheon and Colosseum and the great baths of Caracalla. It built roads that lasted 2,000 and aqueducts that delivered 1,000,000 cubic meters of water a day. It produced Cicero and Virgil and Marcus Aurelius and Galen and a legal tradition that still shapes the laws of the modern world. And in the streets of that same city, children slept in doorways when the rain came. History does not offer us easy consolations. It does not tell us that the arc of time bends inevitably toward justice, or that the suffering of the past was somehow redeemed by the progress of the future. What it offers instead is clarity. The uncomfortable clarity of seeing the past as it actually was, in all its complexity and in its beauty and its resilience. And in that clarity, we can find not despair, but something more useful. The recognition that the problems we face are not new, that the capacity to ignore human suffering in the midst of abundance is not a modern failing, that every generation has faced the choice between indifference and care, and that the choice in every generation remains genuinely open. The child in the rain had no name. He left no record. He was, in the terms of Roman law and Roman demography, a statistical unit, a data point in the mortality tables, a body that would eventually be placed in a terracotta amphora in a pauper's cemetery on the Esquiline Hill, or thrown into one of the great common graves, the Puteculi, that archaeologists discovered there in the 19th century. He was, by every measure of the Roman world's formal structures of power and recognition, invisible. And yet here we are, speaking of him, here we are, reconstructing his world from the evidence of archaeology and literature and law in medicine, trying to understand what it meant to be him, to feel rain on his skin and the cold of the stone beneath him and the hunger that was probably his constant companion. Here we are, treating him as worthy of attention, not as a symbol, not as a rhetorical device in someone else's argument about Roman inequality, or the failures of the Republic, or the achievements of the emperors, but as a human being a child whose existence mattered and whose experience deserves to be understood. That is what history at its best does. It restores visibility to the invisible. It gives voice, however imperfectly and however belatedly, to those who left no voice behind. It tells us that the city we think we know, the marble city of the emperors, the triumphal city of the legions, was also a city of maid and rain and sleeping children. That the true measure of any civilizations, it's not its monuments, but the conditions it provided for those at its margins. Rome, by that measure, was magnificent and terrible, creative and cruel, capable of extraordinary tenderness and capable of extraordinary indifference. Simultaneously, the most advanced society the ancient world produced, and a world in which a child could sleep in the rain and be noticed by no one. It was, in other words, deeply human, which is to say, deeply complicated, and not so different from the cities we live in today. Epilogue. The rain still falls, a final reflection. The rain that falls on Rome today falls on the same hills, flows through the same valleys, runs along streets that were laid out 2,000 years ago. The Tiber is still there, still flooding in wet winters, still brown and fast when the storms come in from the west. The ruins of the Subura, buried beneath the modern city, lie beneath the streets of the Monte neighborhood. The coffee bars and trattorias and boutique hotels that now occupy the space where the great insulae once stood. Tourists come to Rome for its monuments, and they are right to marvel at them. The Colosseum, the Forum, the Pantheon, these are among the greatest human achievements in the history of architecture, expressions of an ambition and a capability still astonish. But if you stand in the Monte 90 neighborhood on a rainy November afternoon, when the cobblestones are slick and dark, and the water runs fast in the gutters, and you look into the doorway of a church or a palazzo, you can feel, for a moment, the presence of the city no monument records, the city of the ordinary and the forgotten. The city that was home to millions of people who left no marble inscription, no triumphal arch, no philosophical treatise. Only the traces of their living, buried in the earth, waiting to be read by those willing to look carefully enough. The child who slept in the rain in Rome is, in a very real sense, still there. Not as a ghost, not as a metaphor, but as a historical reality that cannot be wished away or made more comfortable by distance. He was a human being. He was cold and he was wet, and he was probably hungry. He was surrounded by one of the most extraordinary cities in the history of the world, a city of marble, and gold and running water and magnificent art, and none of it was for him. We remember him now. It is not enough, but it is something, and perhaps in the remembering we can ask the questions that his existence demands. What are the children of our own cities sleeping in tonight? And what would it mean to build a world in which no child had to sleep in the rain? The eternal city asks us that question still. It has been asking it for 2,000 years. And we have not yet given it a satisfactory answer.